I'm Sara Katsanis, and I am an instructor and a researcher at Duke Science and Society, and I research how genetic information is used or applied in medical testing and in DNA forensics and law enforcement. Clearly, genetics isn't everything that contributes to how we look and how we behave. But there are certain traits that we can trace back to genetic roots. We can look at a genome and we can find genes that have certain characteristics. Maybe it's a gene that receives salt on the surface of a cell, or maybe it's a gene that makes skin color. We can see that a person who is albino doesn't have melanin, does not produce skin pigment. So that is a genetic trait, and that is something that you can look at the genome and you can make a decision and say, yes, that is clearly genetic. We're starting to see research come out looking at behavioral traits, which is far more difficult to measure than brown color or no color. When you're looking at traits, it's much more difficult to measure. Aggression and passiveness is one of those traits that people have tried to look at. When you're looking at aggression and passivity, there's far more environmental input to how somebody portrays their personality. But it would be hard to sit here and argue that it's entirely environmental. There's probably a significant amount of genetics that goes into behavioral traits. Unlike melanin, I doubt it's one gene. It's probably a network of genes that interact in different ways. Some of them are neurotransmitters, some of them are hormone receptors, hormone producers. There's all sorts of different things that might go into how somebody acts and behaves. So just that is difficult to measure. All those different genes is hard to measure, much less all of the environmental factors that go into it, which is a person abused? Is a person neglected? Is a person with financial security? Socioeconomic differences? There's all sorts of things that might go into how a person behaves. What are the family dynamics? Are they a middle child or a young child or an old child? I mean, eldest child. We see all sorts of differences. An only child or a family of 12. All of these things are going to have an impact on how people behave. Now, all that said, there is evidence of particular genes and genotypes that are linked or associated with specific traits, like aggression. Each of those are, the ones that are studied, like MAOA, have not been well formulated enough to be predictive, to have predictive value. So we can look at retroactively at individuals that express a particular genotype and say, if that person with that genotype was abused as a child, then that person is going to become or has become aggressive as an adult. And you can look at that same cohort and say those people with that genotype that weren't abused are not aggressive as adults. But it's never going to be a 1-to-1 ratio. There's always going to be some outliers and some differences. And when you're measuring abuse, level of abuse, how do you do that? Is it if your parents are wonderful parents, but you have an older sibling that beats you up every Sunday? Is that abuse? I don't know. I'm not a psychologist. I can't really quantitate that. But quantitating those kind of behaviors is very, very difficult. So we see a genetic component underlying because we have these studies and we see these associations, and there's certainly a genetic component to how a person behaves. But there's a lot we don't know. We don't know all the genes. We don't know how to measure environmental impacts, and it's certainly not predictive.